Hello and welcome to our Institute training video where today we're going to be talking about the Old Testament and the relevance of the Old Testament. My name is Steve Kamer. I'm the director of Third Mill Institute, and we're joined by Dr. Richard Pratt, who's co-founder and president of Third Millennium Ministries. So thank you for being with us today, Dr. Pratt.
Hi, Steve. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for this opportunity.
Yeah, that's great. So in our first lesson in the Biblical Foundations course, you talk about the relevance of the Old Testament. And the question I want to ask today is why is the Old Testament relevant? Why do we spend an entire lesson on its relevance and in fact an entire series on it? Why is the Old Testament relevant?
Yeah, that's a great question because a lot of Christians, and everyone needs to know this as you step into teaching this part of the Third Mill curriculum, the first lesson in the first module of the first course of Biblical Foundations. You need to be aware that in many situations, the people you're going to be teaching, and maybe it's true of you too as a teacher, basically don't believe that the Old Testament has much to do with Christianity at all. They look at the Old Testament and they feel like it's very strange and different and is obviously different in many different ways. But they wonder, why don't we just set it aside and just study the New Testament? And so we thought it was important in this series that gives sort of a survey of the Old Testament and what undergirds the whole Old Testament to start off with answering the question, why should we study as Christians? Why should we study the Old Testament? And I think that what we have to do is sort of begin by, and what we do in this lesson is we begin by helping people understand why the Old Testament doesn't immediately appear to most Christians to be relevant for their lives. Now, in 2 Timothy 3:16, the Apostle Paul says that all scripture is inspired or God breathed. And the scriptures he was thinking about primarily at that time in the history of the church, before the writing of the whole New Testament, was in fact the Old Testament. And so this collection of scriptures that he's recommending to Timothy is what we call the Old Testament. And the Apostle Paul believed it to be inspired. And we know, of course, Jesus dealt a lot with the Old Testament too. So we have to ask the question first, why would anyone think, given those kinds of passages in the New Testament, why would anyone think that the Old Testament, well, you can just ignore it and you can stop dealing with it at all? Well, the reason that they feel this way primarily is because if they've taken a look at the Old Testament, and in some settings, Old Testaments are not available to people, but if they've looked at it at all, they know that it feels like, well, it feels like a strange book talking about things that seem far off and very different from the way that we think and the ways that we live as Christians in the New Testament era. And so, what we try to do in this lesson is introduce, first off, to help people understand why they feel this distance or these differences between themselves and the New Testament. If Jesus and the Apostle Paul said that these are scriptures that are inspired by God, then why do we feel as if they're so different? And there are lots of reasons for this, but what we talk about in this class and in this lesson that I think it will be important for you to understand and for you to explain to other people, because it will be tough at times to get these ideas across, um, are the ways in which the Old Testament was inspired by God and the ways in which the Old Testament was shaped and written so that people could understand it. Now, we use some fairly technical words for that. We talk about inspiration, and I think a lot of Christians will say that the Bible was inspired, and these words apply to the New Testament as well. But the technical word that we use, or technical phrase we use in our lesson, is what we call organic inspiration. And when we use the word organic, what we mean is that things are held together and you can't separate them. A lot like the parts or the workings of your body. That's where the organic word comes from. And it's like these things are hooked together and you can't really separate them. Well, what are the things that are hooked together when you think about inspiration? They are first the God Himself, okay, because God Himself is the one that's breathing out the scriptures. But then you also can think that the things that are written down or were written down originally on the scrolls of the Bible, that's part of the picture that holds together with God speaking out. But the third thing that we often don't quite get is that Old Testament authors themselves are part of this inspiration. Now, God's role is to teach the truth and reveal the truth and to reveal it and to protect it by having biblical authors write things down infallibly, inerrantly. They do not make mistakes. But the truth is at the same time, when Old Testament writers write their scriptures, they're still using their personalities. And we know that because different parts of the Bible are different from each other. And a lot of those differences amount to the personalities and the backgrounds and the educational level and the experiences of the human writer. And so don't be confused in thinking that somehow the Bible dropped out of heaven one day into the laps of Israel, that the Old Testament dropped out of the sky one day into the laps of people like Abraham and Moses and David. It's not what happened. Real people wrote these books. And that's why, for example, the law of Moses is also called the law of God. The law in the Old Testament is God's law, but it's also written by Moses. And so you can't separate God from Moses when you're talking about the inspiration. That's what that's what we mean when we say that the scriptures are organically inspired. And this is one of the reasons it feels so different from what we believe as followers of Christ. Because the human writers of the Bible lived in a world that's very ancient, thousands and thousands of years ago. And so they would think in many ways and talk in many ways and use styles and of writing and the language of Hebrew and things like that that were appropriate for thousands of years ago. And so we often feel as if these books are strange. And I think rather than acting as if they don't seem strange to us, it's important for students to understand it's okay. It's okay for you and me as well to understand that things that happen in the Old Testament, well, they're different from what we normally experience in our lives. And so just embrace it and let them know this is one reason, because of the way that the Bible was inspired. There's another reason. It's the fact that the Bible is written by God and by the human authors in ways that will make sense to people living in the old world of the Old Testament. So think about it this way. Not only are the writers talking like they would talk or writing like they would write because they're part of this inspiration, but also they're writing for real people. And so, of course, they're going to express themselves and they're going to say things that people in their day could understand for the most part. There are some parts of the Old Testament where God makes it very clear, I don't expect many people to understand this. But for the most part, he expects ordinary people to be able to understand what's written in the Old Testament in the Old Testament days. And so we call that in this lesson divine accommodation. Accommodation means you're accommodating or you're putting things in ways that people can understand. Well, when you do that, when you have organic inspiration and you have God accommodating people when their understanding and their limitations, when the scriptures are written, then you understand very plainly the source of this feeling we often get that maybe the Old Testament is just strange and it's so distant, it's so different from us. Maybe we can just set it aside and deal only with the New Testament. So that raises then the second big point of this lesson. And that is that the Old Testament is relevant and authoritative for us, even though sometimes it seems very different from the things that we believe, even as Christians, even as New Testament believers. We believe it's relevant in the first place because Jesus and the writers of the New Testament say that it's relevant and that it has authority. Now, that's a problem because out there, and maybe this is true among the people that you'll be teaching, out there are lots of teachers in the church who will say Jesus did not really like the Old Testament. He did not recommend it to people. He did not want people to understand it and obey it. And they say the same kinds of things about the Apostle Paul. They say, no, the Apostle Paul didn't like the Old Testament, and he didn't think it was appropriate for Christians to take it in and to follow it. They'll say that, and they say it so many times. And because the Old Testament feels distant from us, we can sometimes believe what they say, even though when you look at what the New Testament actually says, what Jesus said there and what Paul said there, you find that they taught just the opposite. We can find ourselves sometimes, well, how can I put this? We can find ourselves sometimes thinking, well, the New Testament must not really like the Old Testament because the New Testament is so different. And Jesus seems at times to say, just forget about the Old Testament. Paul does too, but they don't do that. And that's what this lesson focuses on. Some of the ways in which people think that Jesus and New Testament writers rejected the Old Testament when they didn't. And what you're going to find in this lesson, one of the most fascinating things to me is how people miss this. But what you're going to find in this lesson is a focus on the Sermon on the Mount. And I know if you're familiar with the Sermon on the Mount, this is where a lot of well-meaning but mistaken Christian teachers will give the wrong impression of what Jesus was saying. And you know what Jesus says on a number of occasions. He says things like, you've heard that it was said, an eye for eye and a tooth for tooth. But I say to you, turn the other cheek. Ah, there you go. That's one of those passages where Jesus seems to be saying, forget the Old Testament. It's true that in the book of Exodus, we're told an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And it's also true, Jesus said, turn the other cheek. Well, it sounds like Jesus is contradicting the Old Testament. But what we show in the lesson, and you have to be real careful about this because people, generally speaking, don't know this. What we show in the lesson is that Jesus really was not contradicting the Old Testament when he said, but I say, turn the other cheek. Now, how do we know that? Well, what we point out, especially in this lesson, is Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount did not say, you've heard that it was written. You've heard that it was written. No. What he says is, you've heard that it was said. Now, when he says that, what he's referring to there, when he says say, or when he says it was said, he's referring to rabbis. It was a common way of talking about rabbinical tradition. You've heard that it was said. So he's talking about the ways that the Pharisees and other Jewish groups in his day interpreted the law of Moses. If he had wanted to talk directly about the law of Moses, he would have said, you've heard that it was written, but he didn't. He said, you've heard that it was said. And so this is what Jesus says over and over and over again. You've heard that it was said. So he's not talking about the Old Testament itself. He's talking about, well, what the Jews in his day were saying, what their teachers were saying about certain laws and certain principles from the Old Testament. So let me see if I can give you a little insight just into that one about eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and then Jesus saying, but I say to you, turn the other cheek. Here's something that a lot of people don't realize about that law, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It's in what's called the Book of the Covenant in the book of Exodus. It's reported to us in the book of Exodus. And you can look it up and you'll see references to it in the lesson, the Book of the Covenant that Moses received and wrote down at Mount Sinai. Well, the Book of the Covenant, if you take a look at it, actually is designed to be a guide for the ways that the Israelite judges, that is, people who were judging in courts, were to apply the law of Moses. And so the instructions that are given there, for example, like eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, these were instructions that were designed originally by Moses and by the Lord as instruction for judges in court. And we understand that because if you have a good judge is going to render eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. They're going to note what the crime was, and then they're going to punish. The penalty will be appropriate for the crime. And that's what eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth means. It's what you want a judge to do. You don't want to walk into a court, even today, and find that somebody's guilty of murder and have the judge say in the courtroom, turn the other cheek, everybody. Don't worry about the punishment or the penalty for murder. Just everyone turn the other cheek. You don't want that because that would not be right for a court of law. And it wasn't right for the courts of Israel either. So what does Jesus mean then when he says, turn the other cheek? Well, here's what the rabbis had done. They had taken this principle, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, from the courts, and they had translated it and applied it to personal life. So they felt that they were perfectly justified that if somebody did something that insulted you, you could insult them. If they kicked dirt on you, you could kick dirt on them. If they talked bad about you or talked about somebody in your family, you could do the same right back to them. And so this legal law, the law for the courts, was translated into an opportunity for personal revenge. And that's why Jesus says, look, in your relationships with people, turn the other cheek. Bless those who curse you. Don't be full of vengeance. Don't try always to get what's right and what's just, but rather be peaceful and be forgiving. But Jesus didn't want judges to do that in their courts. No, he wanted them to rule with justice. And Jesus just did not want that transferred over into ordinary life. Okay, so there you go. This is a good example of how often we misinterpret what the New Testament says because we are not remembering why the principles of the Old Testament were written, what they were originally intended to say. And so when you study the Bible, you have to be real careful to understand, well, what it meant originally. Now, unfortunately, a lot of your students are probably not going to like this. It's going to be hard for them to accept this. And so you'll find that they'll resist at first. Be patient. Be patient. They'll be okay. Gradually, eventually, most of them will come around and they will see that Jesus was not opposed to the Old Testament, but rather he affirmed it. And of course, you probably have heard these verses before, but one of the most important verses that shows this is right there in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 and the following verses, where Jesus said, don't think that I've come to destroy or to abolish the law. I haven't come to abolish it. I've come to fulfill it. And anyone who teaches someone to ignore the least of the commandments will be least in the kingdom of heaven. You see, Jesus believed that the Old Testament should be obeyed. We're not to throw it away. And the same kind of thing is true for the Apostle Paul. So just be thinking about that as you work your way through this first lesson of this module, because a lot of your students will not understand this, and you'll have to be patient. And what I usually used to say when I would teach students a lot of times is, just hold on. It's okay. If you can't understand or can't agree with me on this, we will probably eventually get there, because there are other issues that they're wrestling with, more basic issues that will help them in this. I hope that makes some sense to this. But if the New Testament does affirm the authority and the relevance of the Old Testament, we do have to face the fact that there are difficulties in application. And that's really the third main part of this lesson. And that is that application of the Old Testament is not a simple thing. Now, sometimes I think people will underestimate how easy it is to apply the New Testament to the Christian life. After all, the New Testament was written thousands of years ago. But just imagine it this way. If it's hard with the New Testament a couple of thousand years ago to apply to our modern world, then it's even more difficult when it comes to the Old Testament. And so what are the things that we have to accept, and we're going to have to help our students know that this is true and for them not to be worried about it? And that is that the Old Testament challenges us. It comes from an ancient world, and the world has always been changing. There are lots of changes in the world between the days of the Old Testament and today. And we just have to recognize that. And we also have to recognize that the challenges of our world today are huge. They're big. And we cannot diminish them or make them seem as if they're small, because they're not. But at the same time, while there are these challenges, we need to realize that we don't live on the planet Mars. And Old Testament people lived in the world that you and I live in today. We're not in totally different situations. We have the same God. The God of Abraham is our God. So we should expect that what he did in the Old Testament days to be able to be applied to us today. We have the same God. We have basically the same world. That is the physical world we live in, the social world we live in. We're the same. We live in the same world. Abraham, Moses, David, they had to deal with gravity. You and I have to deal with gravity. They had to deal with the fact that people got sick and died. We have to deal with the fact that the world is a place full of sickness and death, even today. And so while the Old Testament seems strange, it's not completely different. So hold on to those ideas. And then there's a third way in which we're connected to the Old Testament. We're the same kind of people. I mean, just think about it this way. In our day, there are people that are totally removed from the Christian faith. We would call them unbelievers. And they do not even make a pretense of being believers. But then you know that there are people that go to church and claim to be Christians, at least for a little while, but they don't live like Christians. They're not being faithful to their claim, their profession of faith in Christ. So there's two kinds of people: a total unbeliever, then someone who says, I believe, but they're not living it out. But then you have a third category of people today, and these are people who are, they are people who love Christ and are truly redeemed and truly saved, and they're on their way to the new world in Jesus, the new creation in Jesus, and they are his followers. Okay, so we have three kinds of people that we deal with in our world today. Well, in the Old Testament days, they also dealt with three kinds of people. People who wrote the Bible, the Old Testament, they dealt with three kinds of people too. They dealt with the fact that they had people out there in the world who had nothing to do with the Lord, completely separated from it, Gentiles primarily. Then they had people, even in Israel, who professed to be followers of the Lord, but really weren't. And then finally, there were true believers. And so when the Old Testament was written, it was written for these three kinds of people in different ways. And when we apply it to our day, we're applying it to these three kinds of people. So ask yourself a question anytime you look at a passage in the Old Testament. What was the impact of this passage for unbelievers? What was the impact for people in Israel who were not true believers? And what was the impact that was intended for true believers? And you'll find yourself being able to realize that in the Old Testament, they had these three kinds of people, and we have these three kinds of people in our day as well. So while there are challenges to applying the Old Testament to our day, because of the differences and those kinds of things, there are also connections that allow us to bridge the gap between what's written in the Old Testament and what we believe and practice and live and feel today in our Christian lives. Okay, so those are really important factors, but here is the hard one. Here's the hard one, the truly hard one. And that is that the Old Testament and the New Testament represent the revelation of God given over time. And as time passed in the days of the Old Testament, and in fact in the New Testament too, as time passed, God revealed more and more of himself. And because he revealed more of himself as he interacted with his people and interacted with the world, we have to take into account those developments that went along. So just think about it simply this way. In the days of Noah, God commanded Noah to get into an ark to avoid the flood. Well, God did not command David to get into an ark to avoid a flood. Why? Well, because there was no big flood in his day. Simple. Things had developed. In the Old Testament, early on, Abraham had various places where he could worship. But later, when you got to the time of Moses and then even further, David and his descendants, there was one place to offer sacrifices. Abraham could offer sacrifices many places, but not in the days of David. That's development inside the Old Testament. But then there's this huge development between the Old Testament faith and the New Testament faith. And a lot of times people don't realize this, but there's this gap between Old Testament and New Testament. And it was the time when Israel was exiled. And you're going to find in this entire module that exile was a big factor in the ways that things developed and changed between the Old Testament days and the New Testament days. So just understand that there are these kinds of developments. In the lesson, we call these theological developments, or sometimes we call them epical developments. Epic. An epic is a big period of time because the Old Testament does tend to divide into big, large periods of time when God would give a whole lot more new revelation and a whole lot more later on and a whole lot more later on. And so anytime you read a portion of the Bible, you have to be ready to factor in those kinds of developments that are in the Bible, epical developments or big theological developments. There's a second kind of major development, and that has to do with culture. The fact that Abraham didn't have a car to drive. There was no such thing as an airplane in Abraham's day. There was no electricity in Abraham's day. In fact, when you read some of the things that happened in the Bible, you get a sense that, well, this is a very ancient culture, and it's just such a different place than what I face in my day. And so we have to take those cultural things into view as well. And then finally, we have to realize that the people that we're reading about in the Old Testament, many of them were very different from the experience. They had experiences that were very different from our experiences. So they were shaped into different people. I mean, remember that the people, the heroes, especially in the Old Testament, they had spectacular experiences of God. I mean, can you imagine seeing the Red Sea split and walking across it on dry land? Can you just imagine doing that? Would that impact your life? If you did that today, would that change your life as a Christian? The answer is yes. Well, people in the Old Testament had experiences like that. And so sometimes we will have a difficulty in connecting with them. But the truth is that there's this development that's always taking place in the ways that people live, and the ways that people think, and what they feel spiritually before the Lord. And we have to take those developments into account when we apply the Old Testament to our day. So this lesson has some really important concepts in it. And the main concept is the Old Testament is authoritative and it is relevant for the Christian life. But we have to be careful when we apply it. And actually, that's what the rest of this whole series called the Kingdom, Covenants, and Canon of the Old Testament. That's what that is about. That's what that module, that piece of your curriculum is about. How to work your way through these kinds of things. But try to get your students at the end of this lesson, try to get them to the point where they're able to affirm that, yes, even though it may be difficult to know how to do this, how to use the New Testament in our Old Testament, rather, in our Christian lives, it's still important. It's still authoritative. It's still relevant, even though it may be difficult. And if you can just get them to that point, then you will have taken them many, many steps toward the goal of being able to embrace the Old Testament as the Word of God, which is what it is, and then to follow Christ in his affirmation of the authority and relevance of the Old Testament.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Pratt. I think that is so helpful. Just that we see we can't set aside the Old Testament, that we have the three types of people that we're applying it to and that it is God's word and it needs to be taken importantly. So I think that's really helpful. And for trainers, as you're engaging with this, you can even watch this a couple times and pick up some of this stuff that is so helpful. So thank you, Dr. Pratt.
Thank
We
you.
really appreciate that. And I know it will be very helpful.
God
So,
bless you, everybody.
all right. God bless. If you have any other questions, please feel free to check out our website at thirdmillinstitute.org. And of course, you can email us at the institute at thirdmill.org. We are always there and would be happy to help.